Rabbi Joel, everybody, this is Rabbi Oliver Spike Joseph. I'm joined today by Rabbi Joel. This is the first in our series of Parshat Shavuah, coming back for the new year. It's the month of Ellul. It's shortly going to be the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. And we are back learning about the Parsha. This week's Parsha is Ki Tavo. Rabbi Joel, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Nice to see you, Oliver.
Really nice to see you. You're a rabbi at the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem, Rosh Yeshiva, and you're also the rabbi at Nefesh Masorti Synagogue, one of my long-term rabbis and a very good friend. We're looking at the Parshat Ki Tavo, and in particular, we have in this parsha the clause or the few words that we read at Pesach, which says Arami Oved Avi. My father was a wandering Aramean. Translation, exact translation uncertain. A paragraph which qualifies our identity as refugees and our identity as people freed from slavery in Egypt, who go forth and prosper in the world and ultimately arrive to the land of Israel. That's in our parsha. At the end of the parsha, we have a list of blessings and curses, one of which qualifies again the crucial importance of taking care of those most vulnerable in our society. There is a dichotomy here. One is self-identifying as a refugee, self-identifying as a person who's gone through an exodus. The other end of that spectrum is being people who are careful, caring, and taking care of those most vulnerable. Say a little bit more about those two aspects in relation to this week's parsha.
So I mean, you presented it almost as if there was a contradiction there, but I think the tradition views them as interwoven. That if we read in Deuteronomy chapter 10, "V'ahavtem et hager ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim," it assumes that you should love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and that those are woven together. It isn't that you were a stranger and you kind of have you've cornered the market on strangeness. You are a ger, and you are a stranger, and that's your identity. And you pull that out as a trump card, because whenever anyone is oppressing you, you say, "Yeah, that's me. I'm the ger. I'm the stranger, and that's my." It's on the contrary. It's that I was a stranger, and now that I'm a majority, now I'm not a ger. Now I am living as a free person in my own land, and now the question is, how am I going to treat the stranger who comes to live under my auspices? And Deuteronomy chapter 10 says, well, there's something about your experience in Egypt means that you have to now be very cautious about how you treat gerim, and there's lots of different ways of reading that. There's a bunch of different ways of reading where that caution should come from. One of them is you knew what it was like being oppressed. The Egyptians oppressed you, and you know what that's like. So you of all people should avoid oppressing. But you could also read it in a more positive light. You were a ger in Egypt for many years, and you were looked after in Egypt. They didn't kill you, and they kept you going, and you've learnt from the Egyptians how to actually care for the stranger and pass that on. Ahavtem et hager ki gerim hayitem, and we have sources that say exactly that our obligation towards the stranger is actually rooted in the fact that we survived Egypt, and that we know that cultures are supposed to look after strangers. That's the thing, and we learnt that from Egypt. And I guess
there are two different parts there, because I think the Gerim Hayitim Be'eretz Mitzrayim, the fact that you were strangers in the land of Egypt, might skip over some of the psychology whereby we hold on to that identity in perpetuity, partly because of the experience of Jewish history, where some of the persecutions continued, and separating out from that's the slave mentality or the mentality of being the persecuted is actually very hard. And I think in addition to that, in this generation, we have a world which is much more chaotic than in this 20 years than perhaps the previous 20 years. and arguably the most chaotic the world has looked like since perhaps the Second World War. And I think there's also a kind of bunker mentality where we might return to that sense of being vulnerable or persecuted, and therefore totally unable to aid the stranger or the most vulnerable in our society, because we're back considering that we're the most vulnerable or we're the most persecuted. And so my interest in this week's Parsha and that perhaps dichotomy is, how do we kind of free ourselves of that sense of persecution? Actually, people can act for the most vulnerable. And clearly in this week, I'm thinking about those escaping Afghanistan as the Taliban returns.
So we don't assume that people who have been abused are likely to be the most compassionate, least abusive members of society. We assume, in shorthand, that people who've had a roughest time are likely to pass that on. And so I think there's something about the Jewish experience of suffering is that we have to internalize it, but not get lost in it. Gerim hayitem, you were gerim, but you're not gerim now.
Gerim hayitem.
It's in the you have to put it in the past. Like, so if you believe yourself to be vulnerable, and that's the way you view the world, and you think, and you read Jewish history as an opportunity to feel vulnerable at every moment, then that is self-defeating. Like I don't think that's a healthy place to be. The question is, can I internalize the value of being a ger without being so broken by the experience that I have to be concerned for my own survival at every moment? Because it's like kind of you're trying to capture a sense of what it would have been like to be abused, but at the same time not being abused. Like, you're not. So that's a complicated thing to do, I think. It's complicated because you can lose yourself in that very easily, because, as you said, you can fetishize your own victim status and make that the core of your identity in a negative way, in a way that then backfires on other people. Like, I think that another way of reading that verse in Deuteronomy 10 is actually a threat. V'ahavtem et hager ki gerim hayitem beretz Mitzrayim. You should love the stranger, for you were strangers in Egypt. It's like, what happened when you were strangers in Egypt is that God listened to you because you were suffering, and that's the nature of our God, is that He's the God who listens to the weak, and just see what will happen if you try abusing the gerim in your own society. Like, is God going to be on your side or their side? The answer is He'll be on their side. And He will bring them out. He'll bring them out with a mighty hand and with a strong arm, in the same way as He brought you out. So your experience of being a ger is that God is on the side of people who are suffering. And so look in society and see the people who are suffering. And work out who they are, because you have to look after them, because God listens to tears, and that's a threat. Like, that's a threat to the comfortable.
And it seems in this week's Parsha, in relation to the curses and the blessings, there's this a piece of the Parsha that we take with us to Rosh Hashanah, which prays, where we hope to be the head and not the tail. And it speaks specifically in this week's Parsha that if you are to think that you can oppress the stranger, you will find that they will overtake you, which speaks specifically to what you're saying, that the God that we know of the Torah is a God who will be on the side of the most oppressed. Rabbi Joel, it's been wonderful to learn with you. You have the last word. I wish you and your family and your community a really happy and sweet New Year.
And to you, Oliver, thank you very much. So just where we ended up there, just like, the verse that we ended up there from Deuteronomy 27, aror mateh mishpat ger yotom v'almanah, like, cursed be the one who perverts justice for the weakest members of society. And we're called upon to actually say that out loud in this week's Parsha. We say out loud, cursed be the one. So that's a very powerful thing to say, like, to articulate the idea that I am cursed if I don't look after the people who are the weakest members of society. So I think the notion of a ger is really about the stranger who comes to live in your midst. And we can feel disempowered by by modern media, because we see suffering happening all over the world, and we think, well, what can I do about this, that, and the other? It's like, where does my responsibility kick in with seeing suffering across the world? But that, I don't think, is the notion of a ger. The notion of a ger is the person who has actually come to live with you, and living with you creates then responsibility. Like, it's once they're part of your political entity, then you have a responsibility. They become a ger relative to you, and ger is a relative term. Ger plays both ways. We were gerim in Egypt, and Abram was a ger, and like a ger is just someone who lives as a stranger living amongst normal people. And so our real responsibility is to people within our society who then have minority status, and the Bible is pretty blunt about the social responsibility that we bear for minorities.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Thanks, Oliver.